Today's episode was recorded live at the Old North Church in Boston and includes footage inside the steeple as well as inside the church. We're discussing the start of the American Revolution, including the Old North Church, Paul Revere's ride, Lexington and Concord, as we all celebrate these momentous occasions in American history 250 years ago. Make sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram, join our Facebook group, and check out our website at www.fastfunhistory.com. And now, Revolutionary War Rarities. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Revolutionary War Rarities, the podcast from the Sons of the American Revolution. I want to start with something that is a pretty famous saying, and that is, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere." On April the 18th, 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, "If the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch in the North Church tower as a signal light. One if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and sound the alarm in every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm." Those are the famous words of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, at least the start of that poem called Paul Revere's Ride. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote that in 1860, some 85 years after the events occurred right here in the Old North Church steeple. And today happens to be April the 18th of 2025, the 250-year anniversary of this specific event. So what a blessing it is to be here today. So what was the day like? What was the day, April the 18th and April the 19th, like in this part of the world? Well, April the 17th and 18th, it rained on and off most of the day. So it was muddy, it was cloudy, it was foggy. The afternoon rolled on April the 18th. You're approaching 12 hours from the actual start of the American Revolution. Around 5 o'clock, the skies began to clear, thankfully, because if it had been foggy, there was questions as to whether or not the signal would ever be able to be seen, even though it was hung in that top window up there in the North Church Tower. Now, that was about 5 o'clock. The signal came out in the neighborhood of 10 o'clock or so. Paul Revere had to cross the river. The two lanterns that were lit signaled that the British were going to be traveling by sea or traveling across to Charlestown on their path up to Lexington, Massachusetts. But who hung those lanterns in the North Church steeple? Well, it's generally credited to a man named Robert Newman. Robert Newman was a sexton in the church, and that's basically someone who helped to maintain the facility. He was a gentleman who would have had the key and would have had access. There are people that give some additional credit to a gentleman named Captain John Pulling. Captain John Pulling was a vestryman or a senior member of the church at that time. There's a third individual who was credited with having stood watch outside the church named Thomas Bernard. Most people are not aware that the lanterns were lit for a very short period of time. Now, the documentation all is in agreement that those lanterns were lit for a very short period of time. Some people say 30 seconds, some people say as much as 2 minutes. But the fact is, the lanterns weren't lit for very long. Why were they not lit for very long? Because those individuals that were lighting those lanterns and holding them in the windows were committing treason to King George III by simply doing that. So they held the lights, they blew the lights out, and they escaped through a window. They didn't go through the door, they escaped through a window of the church. Robert Newman, the sexton of the church, was actually arrested the next day for that action that he took. So it's 10 o'clock, the lanterns are lit, Paul Revere crosses the river to go by sea. But Paul Revere wasn't by himself. William Dawes was another individual who had been signed up to help with this process, and he went by land, went out the Boston Neck and up and around, and we'll show that to you on a map today. So who was Paul Revere? Paul Revere was a lot of things. One of the more interesting characters in American history. He was a bell ringer. He rang the bells here at this church. He wasn't a member of this church, but as a child, he rang the bells at that church. He was a bell maker. There are many bells in this country still to this day, many in the Northeast, that were crafted by Paul Revere. He was an artisan. He was an accomplished horse rider. He was a silversmith. He was a dentist. Most people don't realize he was a dentist. He was a forensic dentist. He was the gentleman who identified the body of Dr. Joseph Warren, who was killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And he did that through the dental records of the work that he had done on Dr. Joseph Warren. So whose horse did Paul Revere ride? Because it was known that he didn't own a horse at that time. That man's name is John Larkin. John Larkin owned a series of horses. Many people believe that the name of that particular horse that he rode that night is named Brown Beauty. That's debatable, but many people believe that it was Brown Beauty that he rode. He left and rode for 12 and a half miles, roughly, to Lexington, and arrives at the Hancock Clark house in Lexington in the neighborhood of midnight. He followed about 30 minutes later by William Dawes, who shows up in the same place. Now, they went to that home because they knew that's where Sam Adams and John Hancock were staying at that moment. And they also believed that the British were coming to try to capture those two gentlemen. There was a bounty on those two guys' heads, so they needed to get them identified, get them out of town so that the British couldn't capture them. Then they went towards Concord. Of course, William Dawes and Paul Revere did not make it to Concord, but had met up with a gentleman named Dr. Samuel Prescott, who did make it to Concord, Massachusetts, and notified that surrounding area. There's documentation. People believe there were as many as 30 to 40 individuals who participated in various rides to let everyone know what was happening with the British that particular night. So, roll the clock forward a little further. About 5 a.m., the British arrive at Lexington Green, and there is a battle there. There's about 77 American forces or militiamen or Minutemen that show up on Lexington Green about 5 a.m. By the neighborhood of 7 to 8 o'clock in that neighborhood, the British, they arrive in Concord. And the reason they go to Concord is to capture the weapon stores at James Barrett's farm. They arrive there. When they get to Lexington, there's no Sam Adams, there's no John Hancock. When they get to Concord, there is no weapon store. They found nothing. So the British begin their retreat back to Boston in the neighborhood of about noon that day. By this time, there are hundreds and even thousands of militiamen who have lined up to greet them on their exit and their return to Boston. Those thousands of individuals hid behind trees, rock walls, cows, houses, and pestered them the entire way back, to the tune of where there were many, many British soldiers that were killed. There were many that were injured, and there were many that were simply lost. We don't know what happened to them. So, did the British accomplish anything that day? Well, they accomplished in starting the American Revolution. They did not accomplish any of their main objectives, that is, to find Sam Adams or John Hancock. They did not capture any weapons in Concord, but they did learn that the Americans were willing to fight. They did learn that these people were riled up and that they were now at war, and they could fight, and they did fight. That's what the British learned about the Americans that day. This is a day that goes down in history, of an iconic day in American history, and the North Church Tower is one of the most iconic visuals of the American Revolution, and I'm thrilled to be here today. It is an honor to be in this city on the 250th anniversary, April the 18th, 2025, of this precious day in American history. Now, we will talk on the next episode about the noble train of artillery that came from Fort Ticonderoga, because April 19th, 1775 is when the siege of Boston started. It did not end until that noble train of artillery from Fort Ticonderoga arrived on Dorchester Heights. And that's going to be what we talk about on the next episode when we discuss with individuals from Fort Ticonderoga about that event as well. And my friends, that is another Revolutionary War rarity. We thank you for joining us today. Please join us again in 2 weeks for the next episode. This has been a production of the National Society Sons of the American Revolution, www.sar.org.